Wow, so a lot has happened. We've had a $200,000 donation that was kind of sketchy being returned, a final vote to call a public inquiry into this whole situation, and new testimony from the top official from Canada's National Security Agency, CSIS, and we've gotten all of this in the last, 3 days? If you've been having trouble keeping up with everything that's going on with this huge Canadian story, don't worry, that's exactly what I'm here for, to help you break it all down. First, I'll get you quickly up to speed in case you haven't watched the previous videos, and then we'll dive into this mountain of new information because things are moving pretty quickly. About a week ago, several accusations were laid out both by Global News and the Globe and Mail, and they said that based on CSIS documents that were leaked to them, this member of parliament right here, Han Dong, a Toronto member of parliament for Don Valley North, that individual riding in Toronto, has been monitored by CSIS with suspicion that he may be a part of a network of foreign agents trying to influence Canadian elections and general policy. Based on this report, Chinese international students as well as Chinese seniors were bussed in to vote for Han Dong during the Liberal Party's nomination process to determine which person would run on behalf of the Liberals for this individual riding in the 2021 election. The report also says that these seniors had the name of the candidate written on their arms so that they could remember who to vote for, and that students were given counterfeit letters showing them as having an address in that specific riding so that they could go vote. And it also says that these students were told that if they didn't participate in this activity, that they would lose their student visas. And this is just one of many stories that are piling up, making Canadians concerned about election interference, including the potential signal boosting of inaccurate news reports being sent to specifically Chinese Canadians to sway their views on certain political candidates that were deemed to be against the interests of China. There have been some major steps that have been taken over the past few days that shows what direction this whole situation is going to go into, so let's get into this new information. Now, there have been a series of House of Commons committee meetings called on an emergency basis, as you can see here, here, and here, where politicians from all parties have been trying to figure out what should be done about this situation, and each individual party has a different viewpoint here. Listen, I'm going to put things into perspective for you by telling you what the government's current position on all of this is. And by the way, if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep on getting Canadian updates just like this one. The Liberals haven't been denying that election interference attempts are happening. They're saying, yes, we're aware that foreign governments of all different countries are trying to interfere with our elections to promote their national interests. But the response to this is that, hey, we've set up a number of nonpartisan groups to investigate the situation, and they determined that, well, the elections were free and fair both in 2019 and 2021. Trudeau pointed this out in a press conference just yesterday, and he was actually getting a little bit frustrated because he just kept on getting questions about this whole situation when the press conference was supposed to be about a childcare deal that he reached in Manitoba.
How can Canadians trust that elections have not been influenced by foreign governments when the information is always protected by national security laws?
I'm pretty sure everything I've said over the past 20 minutes answered that question, but I will do it one more time just for the Canadian press. We put in place strong, independent mechanisms by top public servants who get full access to everything that all of our intelligence and security communities look into and find and monitor on an ongoing basis every day in Canada, particularly during elections. And those top independent public servants were part of a committee that we created after coming into office, because it didn't exist before, for the 2019 421 elections and ongoing, concluded in an independent and nonpartisan way that despite the existence of ongoing attempts at Chinese interference, that interference did not impact the outcomes of the election in 2019 and 2021. That's not me who's saying it, that's the panel of top public servants who are independent and tasked with exactly that, supported by the work done by our intelligence and security agencies. So Canadians can absolutely be confident in those 2019 and 2021 elections.
So Trudeau points to two different organizations and says, hey, they determined that there was no interference that impacted the outcome of the election. But what are these two organizations exactly, and how much can we truly trust them? When Trudeau talks about the panel that deemed these elections to be free and fair, he's specifically talking about this. It's called the SITE Task Force, SITE standing for Security and Intelligent Threats to Elections Task Force. And this is made up of sort of two different parts inside of this body. The first one is the panel of top national security officials, and then the other section here are the different agencies that are briefing this panel as to what's going on in terms of interference. So the RCMP, the CSE, the Communication Security Establishment, GAC, the Global Affairs Canada, and CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, will all brief this panel of national security officials and top public servants so that they can determine whether or not there is sufficient interference. But there is one big caveat that makes this task force have a big problem, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. And this is a caveat that Trudeau doesn't mention when he's bringing it up. The second organization that he points to is called NSICOP. It's a parliamentary committee that stands for National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. Before the Liberal government was in power, this actually didn't exist, but this is a committee in the House of Commons that has top security clearance so that they can actually review what's going on with Canada's top security agencies. And this is bipartisan. There's members from all different parties in this committee, with 4 Liberals, one Bloc Québécois, one NDP, 2 Conservatives, as well as 1 senator who was formerly a member of provincial parliament for the NDP. The idea was that it would be a good idea to have a committee like this that can actually see the documents that are being passed around between CSIS and other similar organizations, so that we actually have some publicly elected officials who have this kind of information instead of it just being in the hands of the sort of the top security clearance people in the country. Now, you have to give the Liberal government credit where credit is due. These organizations and mechanisms didn't exist when they came into power and were created to try to front run a situation like this with growing interference from other countries. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some big problems with these newly set up organizations, and I want to specifically talk to you about one of them. Let me explain what I'm talking about. You already know about the SITE Task Force and the fact that it's their job to call out foreign interference if it could impact the election, but what's not clear is what would have to happen for them to actually do something, or in other words, what is the threshold that needs to be crossed before they tell the public that there has been interference. The shocking thing here is, and let me make this abundantly clear, the SITE Task Force doesn't know or even define what this threshold is. In other words, they don't know what amount of interference or what event of interference would have to happen for them to actually do anything about it. That is never defined anywhere. Let me show you. This task force is supposed to make a public announcement if the panel determines that an incident or an accumulation of incidents has occurred that threatens, here's the important part, that threatens Canada's ability to have a free and fair election. And this is ultimately a judgment call on the part of the panel here, and they can use a couple different points to determine whether or not this impacts a free and fair election, including the degree to which incidents undermine Canadians' ability to have a free and fair election, the potential of incidents to undermine the credibility of the election, and how confident they actually are that their intelligence and information is accurate. And all throughout the document that sort of describes this SITE task force, you're going to see language that says free and fair election. Free and fair election. You got to determine whether or not our election was free and fair. But the big gaping problem here is there is no definition of what a free and fair election actually means. And the panel, the group of people that have to make this decision on whether or not we've had a free and fair election, they also don't know what free and fair means, as demonstrated by this clip from this hearing that was held just a couple of days ago, where one of the panel members had to testify about this very topic.
In the instance that we have been talking about, which is the 2021 election, for which I was a member of the election the panel, and due to, through a series of meetings and a significant amount of discussion based on information flowing to the panel, we determined that a threshold, and this is not a bright line, this is a value judgment on the part of the panel, had not been met. And that, as it happened, means that we did not define a threshold since it was not met. But we were seeing indications that foreign interference could be occurring. And indeed, I think it's been on the public record for a long time that this is an ongoing issue. reports by intelligence agencies, reports by the National Security Intelligence Community of Parliamentarians, etc., have pointed to the fact that foreign intelligence is an issue, and it's a growing issue, as Mr. Morrison has said. I think the problem becomes here understanding what you're seeing on the ground, and whether social media campaigns, to pick an example, are a reflection of the politics of the day, or whether they are in fact instigated by foreign actors. And there is a very difficult and gray area there.
So he says because we never crossed the threshold, we also never defined what that threshold is. So the task force and this panel don't have any idea of what their definition of a free and fair election is. And he also talks about the point that, well, it's actually very difficult to get clear evidence that there is foreign interference happening. He uses the example of the social media campaigns that were spread and were boosted during the 2021 election to try to target certain individuals and try to sway people to not vote for them. Is that something that's being sponsored and boosted by foreign governments, or is that just a result of the sort of sharing of this information amongst free Canadians? And because of the situation, you can't look at before and afters or sort of comparative numbers on whether or not interference is impacting the freeness and fairness of an election, because you can't see how many votes would have been cast if there was no interference and how many votes were cast with interference. You can't compare two things that didn't happen, right? And this all raises the question of if this panel, one of the most important panels in determining if there is interference, whether or not this panel can actually ever be effective. And it's for two different reasons, right? The first one being, well, they don't know, and more importantly, Canadians don't know what the threshold is that has to be met before they say, yes, there was interference, and we're going to tell Canadians about it. The second point being, they're never going to be sure that there is interference happening because of the very nature of interference, in that it's designed not to be detectable. Therefore, it's very, very hard to have conclusive evidence about that the panel would need in order to determine that a threshold would have been met. So that goes over the biggest problems with the Liberals and Trudeau's biggest defense of their actions in this situation, that being that the panel that they're pointing to that said, hey, they determined we had a free and fair election, well, there is some major gray area with this panel. Now, the other major update to this story that we haven't gone over yet is the recommendation to call for a public inquiry and the final vote that was held on this just a couple of days ago on this specific matter. The Bloc Québécois, the New Democratic Party, and the Conservatives all ended up being on board for some sort of public inquiry, with some minor squabbles and arguments back and forth about whether or not this inquiry would be just specifically about Chinese interference or more broad about interference from all potential other state actors. Ultimately, they sorted all of those differences out and all voted in favor of a public inquiry against the wishes of the Liberals, who said, well, a public inquiry into this matter would kind of be pointless because all of the information would need to be redacted anyways for national security reasons, so it would be just as effective as the committee meetings that we're having right now. It's a waste of resources. We probably shouldn't do it. That's what the Liberals were saying. But the committee voted in favor of a public inquiry 6-5, with the 5 votes being Liberal for no and every other party being the part of that 6 on this committee. So because they voted in favor of this public commission or public inquiry, does that mean that this commission or inquiry would actually start happening as of tomorrow? Well, no, not exactly. You see, these meetings were being held on an emergency basis in this sort of period of time where the House of Commons wasn't in session, but the House of Commons is set to sit again as of this Monday. But the important thing to note here is that this vote in favor of a public inquiry isn't binding. It doesn't make it happen. It's just that this committee brings it to the House of Commons and reports its recommendation to have a public inquiry. At that point, the Liberal government would ultimately get the final say on whether or not a public inquiry is held. So the current government can essentially squash any public inquiry, that is, unless the NDP, who all of a sudden have a lot more power, exercise that power. Let me explain what I'm talking about. You see, for the past 6 to 8 months or so, the Liberals and the NDP have sort of been in a agreement where they said, hey, we'll work together, we'll make sure that we don't trigger an election by voting against you, as long as you do these things that the NDP wants you to do, Liberals. You gotta give us more dental care, you've gotta help us out with a number of these sort of different issues that are important to us as NDP. As long as you do those things, we're not going to vote you out and trigger an election. But if the NDP determines that, hey, this public inquiry is a big enough issue to us that we will withdraw our support for the Liberals, well, this could trigger an election if the Liberals do not hold a public inquiry. So we're going to have to see what the NDP does here. Now, what about this $200,000 donation that seems to be making the rounds in the news? Well, here's the story. Back in 2016, a Chinese billionaire donated $1 million, $200,000 of which went to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. Now, a recent news story revealed that this Chinese billionaire who made this donation was then reimbursed for the donation by the Chinese government. Obviously, a big issue if Chinese government money is going to fund charities in Canada tied to big political leaders. A couple of days after this information was revealed, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation put out this statement. They said, as an independent, nonpartisan charity, ethics and integrity are among our core values, and we cannot keep any donation that may have been sponsored by a foreign government and would not knowingly do so. In light of these allegations, we're going to refund the donor all amounts received with respect to the donation pledge. So we're going to give back to that Chinese millionaire $200,000. Even though maybe he was reimbursed by the Chinese government, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation says, okay, we're going to wipe our hands of this, just give the money back, we don't want to deal with this. Now, regardless of what you think of these actions by this foundation, there's another important tie into this story that connects it more to the site task force and the panel that we were previously talking about, and that is all about a man named Morris Rosenberg. Back in 2016, Morris Rosenberg was the head of the Trudeau Foundation, and he helped to facilitate this $200,000 donation from the Chinese billionaire. But what makes this extra interesting is that recently he was also the person that Trudeau recruited to write a report on how effective that site task force and panel were at actually identifying and warning people about interference. Some have called this a conflict of interest, as the report concluded that foreign interference didn't impact the outcome of the elections. People have saying this is a conflict of interest because of his prior role as a member of the Trudeau Foundation. But even though his report pointed out that based on the panel's findings, there was no interference that impacted the free and fair election, we've already talked about the gray area there, he still does talk about this gray area and points out the problems with this panel, specifically that it's somewhat confusing as to what is required in order for this threshold to be met. The opening paragraph says that an announcement would officially occur only if the panel determines that an incident or accumulation of incidents has occurred that threatens Canadians' ability to have a free and fair election, and he goes on to point out how this free and fair election threshold isn't anywhere defined in this panel's mandate. A lot of information to look into, but I hope this has all given you more clarity about the situation. I know it's going to be interesting watching what the government does with these recommendations of a public inquiry coming from this committee, and whether or not the NDP really holds their feet to the fire on this one, or if they just let them sort of cancel this public inquiry and say, we're not going to vote you out of government if you don't do this public inquiry. But if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep on getting updates about Canadian issues just like this one. It takes a lot of time and energy to go through all the committee meetings and find these clips and compile this information, so I appreciate your support. But with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.